I never imagined that opening my home to my daughter's new husband would turn me into a stranger in my own house. What started as a temporary arrangement during tough times became a nightmare when Derek decided his mother needed the master bedroom, more than I did. For months, I slept on my own living room couch while Patricia Walsh treated my kitchen like her personal domain and my home like her castle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They thought they had me cornered, helpless with nowhere else to go. But sometimes the most overlooked person in the room holds all the cards, and when I finally played mine, the entire game changed in ways none of them saw coming. When Amy first brought Derek home for dinner, I genuinely liked him. He was polite, well-mannered, and seemed to adore my daughter. Robert and I had raised Amy to be independent and strong, and seeing her with someone who respected her opinions and supported her career goals felt like we'd done something right. Derek worked as a maintenance supervisor at a large apartment complex in downtown Riverside, and while the pay wasn't extraordinary, he was reliable and hardworking. Amy had just landed a promotion at her marketing firm, and together they seemed to have a solid foundation for a future. The wedding was beautiful, small but meaningful, held in our backyard under the old oak tree that had been there since Amy was a child. Derek's parents, Kevin and Patricia Walsh, drove down from their small farming town in the Central Valley. They seemed nice enough during the ceremony, though Patricia made a few comments about how different city life was from what she was used to. She kept asking Amy if she really needed to work so much, suggesting that a woman's place was taking care of her home and family. Amy just smiled politely and changed the subject, but I could see the slight tension in her shoulders. After the wedding, Derek moved into Amy's apartment across town, and life seemed to settle into a comfortable rhythm. They visited us for Sunday dinners, and Derek always helped Robert with yard work or small repairs around the house. He never seemed to take anything for granted, and always offered to contribute to groceries or utilities when they stayed over. For the first year of their marriage, everything felt harmonious. Then the economy took a downturn, and Derek's company started laying people off. He managed to keep his job, but his hours were cut significantly, reducing their household income by nearly 40%. Around the same time, Amy's firm was restructuring, and while she kept her position, the stress was enormous. When they mentioned they were struggling to make rent, Robert and I didn't hesitate to offer them our guest room until they could get back on their feet. Derek seemed genuinely grateful when we made the offer. He thanked us repeatedly and promised it would only be temporary, just until the economy stabilized and his hours picked up again. Amy was relieved too, I could tell. The financial pressure had been weighing on both of them, and knowing they had a safe place to land seemed to lift a burden from her shoulders. We cleared out the guest room, which had been serving as Robert's makeshift office, and helped them move their essential belongings. For the first few weeks, the arrangement worked well. Derek continued looking for additional work, picking up odd jobs on weekends to supplement his reduced income. Amy threw herself even deeper into her career, often working late into the evening on her laptop at our kitchen table. They both contributed to household expenses without being asked, and Derek was genuinely helpful around the house, fixing a leaky faucet and helping Robert replace some rotted deck boards. The first sign of trouble came when Derek received a phone call from his mother one evening in late October. Patricia's voice was loud enough that I could hear her from the kitchen, even though Derek was talking in the living room. Apparently, Derek's father, Kevin, had been injured in a farming accident, breaking his leg in 2 places and requiring surgery. While Kevin was expected to recover fully, he would be unable to work for several months, leaving Patricia to manage both his care and their financial obligations alone. Derek hung up the phone looking devastated. Amy immediately went to comfort him, and they spoke in hushed tones for nearly an hour. When they finally emerged from their conversation, Derek approached Robert and me with obvious reluctance. His parents were facing eviction from their rental house, he explained. The landowner had been patient, but with Kevin unable to work and medical bills piling up, they were 3 months behind on rent with no prospect of catching up anytime soon. Amy's eyes were red from crying when she asked if there was any way Derek's parents could stay with us temporarily, just until Kevin recovered and could return to work. The doctors estimated he'd be cleared for physical labor again in about 4 months, she said, maybe 5 at the outside. She looked so hopeful and desperate that Robert and I found ourselves agreeing before we'd fully thought through the implications. Looking back, that moment was when I should have asked more questions, set clearer boundaries, established a definite timeline. But Amy was my only child, and Derek had been nothing but respectful and helpful since moving in. How much trouble could 2 older adults be for a few months? We had the space, the house was paid off, and helping family in crisis felt like the right thing to do. Patricia and Kevin arrived the following weekend in a battered pickup truck, loaded with garbage bags full of clothing and several cardboard boxes that had seen better days. Patricia immediately began commenting on everything from our neighborhood to our furniture choices. She wondered aloud why we needed such a large television, questioned whether we really watched all the channels we paid for, and suggested that our grocery choices were wasteful and expensive. Kevin, still wearing a leg cast and walking with crutches, was quieter but equally observant. He settled into Robert's recliner within minutes of arriving and began flipping through channels, commenting that we had too many news stations and not enough hunting and fishing programs. When Robert mentioned that he enjoyed watching the evening news, Kevin scoffed and said that city news was just fear-mongering designed to keep people scared and dependent on the government. That first evening, Patricia took it upon herself to reorganize our kitchen cabinets, claiming she was just trying to be helpful. She moved items to what she considered more logical locations, which meant I couldn't find my own coffee mugs the next morning. When I gently mentioned that I was used to the previous arrangement, she laughed and said I'd thank her once I got used to a more efficient system. The sleeping arrangement seemed straightforward at first. Derek and Amy remained in the guest room, while Patricia and Kevin took the small den that connected to a half bathroom on the main floor. We set up a daybed for Kevin so he could elevate his leg comfortably, and Patricia seemed satisfied with the pull-out sofa. Robert and I, of course, remained in our master bedroom upstairs. For the first week, this arrangement held. Patricia did most of the cooking, which was actually helpful since Amy had been working such long hours. Her meals were hearty and filling, though heavily focused on fried foods and casseroles that Robert's doctor had specifically told him to avoid. When I mentioned that Robert was supposed to limit his sodium intake, Patricia waved dismissively and said that doctors today were too cautious, that men had been eating real food for generations without all these modern restrictions. Derek seemed caught between gratitude and embarrassment about his parents' behavior. He would apologize privately for his mother's comments, explaining that she was just set in her ways and meant well. He assured me that as soon as his father could work again, they would find their own place and get out of our hair. Amy, meanwhile, was so buried in work stress that she barely seemed to notice the growing tension in the house. The first major shift came during the second week, when Patricia complained that the den was too cold and drafty for Kevin's recovery. She worried that he wasn't sleeping well because of the temperature, and suggested that maybe Amy and Derek could move to the den temporarily, so that Kevin could use the guest room, which had better heating and a more comfortable bed. Amy immediately agreed, saying she hadn't been sleeping well anyway due to work stress and didn't mind switching rooms. Derek nodded along, though he looked uncomfortable with the suggestion. I wanted to protest, but Robert squeezed my hand under the table and shook his head slightly. We were already helping them out significantly, his expression seemed to say, and a little flexibility wouldn't hurt anyone. So Amy and Derek moved their belongings to the den, and Patricia helped Kevin settle into the guest room. She fluffed his pillows, arranged his medications on the nightstand, and declared that the room was much more suitable for someone recovering from surgery. Kevin seemed pleased with the upgrade, stretching out on the queen-sized bed and commenting that it was the most comfortable he'd been since the accident. That night, as Robert and I lay in our own bed, I mentioned that something about the arrangement felt off. Patricia had moved her clothes into the guest room as well, essentially claiming the space for both herself and Kevin. But Robert pointed out that it made sense for her to stay close to Kevin while he was recovering, especially since he sometimes needed help getting to the bathroom during the night. The second major change happened gradually over the following weeks. Patricia began commenting that our upstairs master bedroom was really too much space for just two people, especially when the house was so crowded. She'd stand in our doorway during conversations, gazing around the room and sighing about how nice it must be to have so much privacy and space. She mentioned that Kevin was having trouble sleeping because Derek and Amy sometimes stayed up late, talking or watching television in the den, which was right next to the guest room. Meanwhile, Amy was working later and later hours, often not coming home until nearly midnight. Her company was in the middle of a major restructuring, and she was essentially doing the work of two people while management decided whether to hire additional staff or continue operating with a reduced workforce. She was exhausted and stressed, and the last thing she wanted to deal with was family drama at home. Derek had managed to pick up some additional hours at work, but he was also spending more time helping his mother care for his father. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kevin's recovery was going well, but he still needed assistance with basic tasks like bathing and preparing meals. Patricia was constantly washing Kevin's clothes, preparing special foods for his recovery, and managing his medication schedule. It was during this period that Patricia first suggested that maybe Robert and I should consider moving to the den temporarily. She framed it as a practical solution to the overcrowding problem. Kevin really needed the quiet of the guest room for his recovery, she argued, and Amy and Derek were young and adaptable enough to handle the den's limitations. But Robert and I were older, she pointed out, and might actually be more comfortable on the main floor where we wouldn't have to climb stairs and would be closer to the kitchen and main bathroom. I was so stunned by the suggestion that I didn't immediately respond. This was our house, our bedroom that Robert and I had shared for over 20 years. The idea of giving up our private space so that Patricia and Kevin could spread out even further seemed absurd. But Patricia wasn't finished with her reasoning. She pointed out that Robert had been having some trouble with his knees lately, and that the stairs might be becoming difficult for him. She suggested that moving to the main floor might actually be better for his health and mobility. She also mentioned that Amy and Derek were planning to start looking for their own place soon, and it would be easier for everyone if sleeping arrangements were more flexible in the meantime. Robert's response was diplomatically non-committal. He thanked Patricia for her concern about his knees and said we'd think about her suggestions. But that night, when we were alone in our room, he admitted that he was starting to feel uncomfortable with how presumptuous Patricia was becoming. This was our house, he reminded me, and while we were happy to help family in crisis, that didn't mean we needed to turn our entire lives upside down to accommodate their preferences. I agreed completely, but I also worried about the impact on Amy if we made a big issue out of Patricia's behavior. Amy was already under enormous stress at work, and Derek seemed genuinely grateful for our help with his parents. The last thing I wanted was to create family drama that would add to Amy's burden or damage her marriage. Unfortunately, my hesitation was interpreted as agreement. Over the next few days, Patricia began making small comments about how much more convenient everything would be once we moved downstairs. She offered to help us pack our belongings and suggested that we could redecorate the master bedroom to better suit Kevin's recovery needs. She even began referring to the guest room as Kevin's room in casual conversation. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in early December. I had been fighting a cold and decided to go to bed early, around 8 o'clock. When I reached the top of the stairs, I found Patricia in our master bedroom, measuring the windows with a fabric tape measure. She had moved several items from our dresser and was examining the space where our bed sat. When she saw me, she smiled brightly and explained that she was just checking whether Kevin's hospital bed would fit better in our room than in the guest room. The physical therapist had recommended that Kevin use an adjustable bed during the final phase of his recovery, and Patricia wanted to make sure there was adequate space for the equipment. I told her firmly that she needed to leave our bedroom immediately, and that any changes to sleeping arrangements needed to be discussed with Robert and me before being implemented. Patricia's expression shifted from surprised to defensive. She said she was just trying to help, that Kevin's comfort and recovery were the priority, and that she thought we had already agreed to move downstairs. When I clarified that we had never agreed to any such thing, Patricia's tone became sharp and condescending. She said that she was disappointed in my selfishness, that a truly caring family member would prioritize an injured person's needs over their own convenience. She pointed out that Robert and I had the entire rest of the house to ourselves most of the time, while Kevin was confined to one small room during his recovery. Our conversation grew heated quickly. Patricia accused me of being territorial and unreasonable, while I maintained that she had no right to make decisions about our living arrangements without consulting us. By the time Robert arrived home from his evening walk, we were standing in the hallway outside our bedroom, voices raised, both clearly angry. Robert listened to both sides of the argument, then calmly told Patricia that while we were happy to help with Kevin's recovery, any major changes to sleeping arrangements needed to be discussed as a family. He suggested that if the guest room wasn't adequate for Kevin's needs, we could look into other solutions that didn't require displacing Robert and me from our own bedroom. Patricia's response was to burst into tears. She sobbed that she was doing her best to care for her injured husband while living in someone else's house, that she felt unwelcome and criticized no matter what she did to help. She said that Kevin's recovery was being jeopardized by the stress and conflict in the household, and that she was beginning to think they should just leave and figure out their housing situation on their own, even if it meant Kevin wouldn't receive proper care. Derek arrived home from work in the middle of this emotional scene. When Patricia tearfully explained what had happened, his face darkened with concern and frustration. He pulled Robert and me aside and said that his mother was under enormous stress caring for his father, and that small accommodations like switching bedrooms temporarily could make a huge difference in Kevin's recovery process. Amy came home an hour later to find the entire household in conflict. She was exhausted from another 14-hour workday and clearly had no mental energy to mediate family drama. When Derek explained the situation to her, she sighed deeply and asked what it would take to keep the peace until Kevin was fully recovered and able to move out. I felt cornered and outnumbered. Everyone seemed to be treating Patricia's request as reasonable and my resistance as stubborn selfishness. Amy looked so tired and stressed that I couldn't bear the thought of adding to her burden. Robert was clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation, but seemed willing to go along with whatever would minimize conflict. That night, after another family meeting that felt more like a negotiation session, we agreed to a temporary bedroom swap. Robert and I would move to the den, Amy and Derek would take the guest room, and Patricia and Kevin would use our master bedroom until Kevin was fully recovered and able to return to work. Patricia assured us it would only be for a few more months, and Derek promised to help us move our belongings and make the den as comfortable as possible. The next day, I found myself packing up 20 years of personal belongings from our master bedroom and carrying them downstairs to a room that felt more like a guest space than a permanent home. Patricia immediately began rearranging the master bedroom to suit her and Kevin's needs, moving our furniture around and replacing our bedding with her own linens. That first night, sleeping in the den, I lay awake on the narrow daybed listening to Patricia and Kevin talking and laughing in what had been my bedroom just hours earlier. Through the thin walls, I could hear Patricia commenting on how much more spacious and comfortable the room was, how much better Kevin was sleeping already, and how nice it was to finally have adequate privacy and quiet. Robert tried to be philosophical about the whole situation. He reminded me that it was temporary, that we were helping family in crisis, and that we'd be back in our own room soon enough. But as I stared at the ceiling that first night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just crossed a line we might not be able to uncross. Patricia had successfully maneuvered us out of our own bedroom through manipulation, emotional manipulation, and family pressure, and I had a sinking suspicion that this was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up to find Patricia in our kitchen at 6 a.m., reorganizing our cabinets again and preparing what she called a proper breakfast for Kevin's recovery. She had moved our coffee maker to a different counter and replaced our usual breakfast foods with items she'd purchased herself. When I reached for my favorite coffee mug, I discovered she'd moved all our dishes to different cabinets and couldn't find anything in my own kitchen. Patricia cheerfully explained that she was implementing a more efficient kitchen organization system and preparing more nutritious meals to support Kevin's healing process. She'd thrown away several items from our refrigerator that she considered unhealthy or expired, including Robert's favorite yogurt and the leftover soup I'd been planning to have for lunch. As I stood in my own kitchen, unable to find my coffee cup and watching a relative stranger discard my food and rearrange my belongings, I realized that giving up our bedroom had been far more than a temporary accommodation. It had been a surrender of authority in our own home, and Patricia had interpreted our compromise as permission to take over completely. But I had no idea that this was still just the beginning. Over the next few days, Patricia would make it clear that she saw our bedroom swap not as a temporary favor, but as a permanent rearrangement that better reflected what she saw as the natural hierarchy of our household. And the document that would eventually change everything was still hidden away in my mother's old desk, waiting for the right moment to remind everyone exactly whose house this really was. The first week sleeping in the den was miserable. The daybed was too narrow for both Robert and me, so we took turns sleeping on the pull-out couch in the living room. Every morning I woke up with a stiff neck and aching back, feeling like a visitor in my own home. Meanwhile, Patricia had completely transformed our former bedroom into what she called Kevin's recovery suite. She'd hung heavy curtains to block out morning light, moved in a humidifier for Kevin's breathing, and set up a small television on our dresser so he could watch his hunting shows without disturbing anyone else. She'd also rearranged all the furniture to create better flow around Kevin's wheelchair and walker, which meant our personal belongings were either shoved into corners or relocated entirely. When I asked about some family photos that had been on our nightstand for years, Patricia explained that she'd packed them away for safekeeping since Kevin needed the surface space for his medications and medical equipment. She assured me everything was stored carefully in boxes in the basement and would be returned once they moved back to their own place. But it wasn't just our bedroom that Patricia was transforming. She'd appointed herself household manager and was implementing what she called efficiency improvements throughout the house. She moved our dining room table against the wall to create more open space for Kevin's wheelchair, replaced our living room arrangement with seating that better accommodated his leg elevation needs, and converted our small home office into a storage area for medical supplies and equipment. Every change was presented as temporary and medically necessary. Kevin needed this. Kevin's recovery required that. The physical therapist had recommended something else. Robert and I found ourselves constantly adjusting to new arrangements in our own home, never knowing what we'd find moved or reorganized when we came downstairs each morning. Derek seemed oblivious to how dramatically his mother was taking over our space. He was working longer hours to cover for his reduced income and picking up weekend shifts whenever possible. When he was home, he spent most of his time helping Kevin with physical therapy exercises or driving him to medical appointments. The few times I tried to mention Patricia's increasing control over our household, Derek would thank me for being so understanding and promise that his parents would be out of our hair soon. Amy was even less present than Derek. Her company's restructuring had turned into a complete departmental overhaul, and she was essentially doing 3 people's jobs while management decided whether to hire additional staff or continue operating with skeleton crews. She left for work before dawn and rarely returned before 10 p.m., often carrying takeout containers and looking utterly exhausted. The few times Amy was home long enough to notice household changes, Patricia would explain, them as improvements she'd made to help everyone be more comfortable and efficient. Amy would nod absently and thank Patricia for taking care of things, clearly too mentally drained to process the implications of what was happening. It was during the third week of our new sleeping arrangement that Patricia announced Kevin would need to stay longer than originally planned. His recovery was going well, she explained, but the doctor wanted him to complete a full course of physical therapy before returning to manual labor. Instead of the 4 months we'd originally discussed, Kevin would need at least 6 months, possibly 8, to ensure he didn't re-injure himself. This news came during Sunday dinner, which had become Patricia's showcase for demonstrating her domestic capabilities. She'd taken over all meal planning and preparation, creating elaborate spreads that she claimed were specifically designed to support Kevin's healing process. The meals were always heavy, meat-centered affairs that bore no resemblance to the lighter, healthier dinners Robert and I usually preferred. When I mentioned that Robert's doctor had recommended reducing red meat and increasing vegetables, Patricia dismissed this advice as typical medical overcaution. She'd been feeding men for decades, she said, and knew what kept them strong and healthy. Kevin was recovering beautifully under her care, which proved that real food was better medicine than any doctor's restrictions. Derek nodded along with his mother's timeline extension, explaining that his father's long-term health was more important than anyone's temporary inconvenience. He assured us that his hours at work were picking up and that he and Amy were saving money to put toward their own place. The longer they could stay with us, the more they could save for a proper down payment instead of just scraping together enough for another rental deposit. Amy looked stricken when Derek mentioned extending their stay. She'd been counting on having her own space back, and the prospect of living in our crowded household for another 4 to 6 months clearly overwhelmed her. But when Patricia started talking about Kevin's medical needs and the importance of families supporting each other during crisis, Amy just nodded weakly and said that family came first. That night, as Robert and I tried to get comfortable on the narrow daybed again, I finally voiced what I'd been thinking for weeks. This arrangement wasn't working, and it wasn't really temporary anymore. Patricia had moved into our home and was systematically taking control of every aspect of our daily lives. She was making permanent changes to our living space, establishing routines that served her preferences, and treating our house like her domain. Robert agreed that things had gotten out of hand, but he felt trapped by the circumstances. Kevin was genuinely injured and needed care. Derek was family now through Amy, and we'd already committed to helping them through their crisis. How could we suddenly change the terms of the arrangement without looking selfish and unreasonable? But my discomfort went beyond just sleeping arrangements and household changes. Patricia had begun making comments about our lifestyle choices that felt increasingly judgmental and controlling. She questioned why Robert and I needed separate cars when one vehicle should be sufficient for people our age. She wondered aloud whether we really needed cable television and high-speed internet when basic services would meet our actual needs. She suggested that our weekly dinner out was an unnecessary expense that could be better spent on household improvements. Most disturbing were her comments about Amy's career priorities. Patricia frequently mentioned that wives should focus on supporting their husbands and building strong homes rather than chasing professional advancement. She suggested that Amy's long work hours were putting unnecessary stress on Derek and that a good wife would find ways to be more present for her husband's needs. When Amy was around to hear these comments, she would respond politely but firmly that she enjoyed her work and was proud of her professional accomplishments. Patricia would smile and nod, then later make remarks to me about how career-focused women often struggled to maintain happy marriages because they put their own ambitions ahead of their family's well-being. These conversations made me increasingly uncomfortable, but I wasn't sure how to address them without creating open conflict. Patricia never said anything directly insulting or obviously inappropriate. She framed her opinions as concern for Amy's happiness and traditional wisdom about marriage relationships. But the underlying message was clear. She disapproved of Amy's independence and career focus and believed Derek deserved a more traditional, subservient wife. The situation escalated significantly during Kevin's fourth week in our master bedroom. Patricia announced that she'd invited Derek's brother Tyler and his wife Monica to visit for the weekend, along with their 8-year-old son Jake. Tyler lived about 3 hours away and rarely got to see his injured father, Patricia explained. And the family visit would be good for Kevin's morale and recovery. I was surprised that Patricia had made this invitation without consulting Robert and me first. But when I mentioned this, she apologized and said she'd been so focused on Kevin's emotional needs that she'd forgotten her manners. She assured me that Tyler's family would be no trouble at all and would probably even be helpful around the house. Derek thought the visit was a wonderful idea. He'd barely seen his brother since moving to Riverside and was excited about the prospect of family time. Amy was less enthusiastic, given her work schedule, but she agreed that Kevin deserved to see his other son and grandson. When Tyler, Monica, and Jake arrived Friday evening, our house immediately felt overcrowded beyond capacity. Patricia had somehow convinced Derek and Amy to give up the guest room for the weekend and move their belongings back to the den temporarily so that Tyler and Monica could have proper accommodations. She'd set up air mattresses in the living room for Jake, which meant our common areas were now filled with sleeping children and scattered toys. But the space issues were minor compared to Monica's attitude about our living arrangements. Within hours of arriving, she was making comments about how nice it was that Derek's parents had finally found a stable living situation after years of struggling in rural rentals. She mentioned that Tyler and she had been worried about Kevin and Patricia's future, especially with Kevin's injury limiting his work options. During Saturday dinner, Monica casually asked whether Patricia and Kevin were planning to stay in Riverside permanently or eventually return to their farming community. Patricia's response was revealing in ways I don't think she intended. She said that Kevin's injury had made them realize they were getting too old for the physical demands of farm labor, and that living in a comfortable home with family support was probably the best arrangement for their retirement years. Tyler nodded enthusiastically and said it made perfect sense for his parents to stay put, rather than trying to restart their lives elsewhere at their age. He pointed out that Kevin was nearly 65 and Patricia was 62, ages when most people were thinking about slowing down rather than taking on new challenges. Monica added that it was wonderful that Derek and Amy were in a position to provide this kind of security for aging parents. I felt a chill run down my spine as I listened to this conversation. Tyler and Monica were talking about Patricia and Kevin's presence in our home as if it were a permanent caregiving arrangement rather than temporary crisis assistance. They seemed to assume that Robert and I had agreed to house and support Derek's parents indefinitely, transforming our retirement years into an extended family compound. When I tried to clarify that the current arrangement was temporary while Kevin recovered from his injury, Monica looked confused. She said Patricia had given her the impression that this was a long-term solution that benefited everyone involved. Patricia quickly jumped in to explain that plans were still being finalized, but that Kevin's recovery was taking longer than expected, and any major decisions would need to wait until he was fully healed. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I could see Robert processing the same concerns I was having. Patricia seemed to be presenting our household arrangement very differently to her family than she was to us. To Tyler and Monica, this looked like a permanent retirement plan. To us, it was still supposed to be temporary medical assistance. That night, after Tyler's family had gone to bed on various air mattresses and couches throughout our main floor, Robert and I whispered about what we'd overheard. It was becoming clear that Patricia had no intention of moving out once Kevin recovered. She was settling into our home as if it were her permanent residence, and apparently telling her family that we'd agreed to this arrangement. Sunday morning brought another revelation when Jake mentioned that his grandmother Patricia had told him he could come stay for part of his summer vacation since they now had plenty of space, and his grandfather Kevin would be feeling much better by then. Monica confirmed that Patricia had extended this invitation and that they were looking forward to giving Jake some time in a different environment while Tyler and Monica took a vacation trip alone. Again, Patricia had made commitments involving our home without consulting us. When I mentioned that we hadn't discussed summer visits, Patricia laughed and said she was just being optimistic about Kevin's recovery timeline. But Jake was already excited about the prospect of spending weeks with his grandparents in their new home, and Tyler and Monica were clearly planning their vacation around this assumed arrangement. The weekend visit concluded with Tyler and Monica expressing gratitude to Robert and me for providing such wonderful care and accommodation for Derek's parents. Tyler made a comment about how fortunate his parents were to have found such a perfect living situation in their retirement years. And Monica mentioned that she hoped we realized what a blessing it was to have Patricia's domestic skills and Kevin's handyman abilities available to help maintain such a large house. After they left Sunday evening, Patricia was practically glowing with satisfaction. She talked about how wonderful it had been to have the whole family together and how much it had meant to Kevin to see his sons and grandson in his new home environment. She mentioned that Tyler and Monica had been impressed with how well organized and comfortable everything was, and that they were so relieved to know Kevin and Patricia had found such a stable situation. Derek was equally pleased with how the visit had gone. He thanked Robert and me repeatedly for making his family feel so welcome and for providing the kind of stable environment that allowed for meaningful family gatherings. He seemed genuinely touched by our hospitality and apparently had no idea that Patricia was presenting temporary assistance as permanent arrangements. Amy had worked through most of the weekend and missed the bulk of the family dynamics, but she commented that it was nice to see Derek so happy and relaxed around his extended family. She'd been so buried in work stress that she seemed grateful. Patricia was handling all the household management and family coordination, but I was beginning to feel like a stranger in my own home. Patricia was making plans, extending invitations, and establishing routines as if she were the primary homeowner. She'd taken over our kitchen, reorganized our living spaces, displaced us from our bedroom, and was now hosting family visits without consulting us. Every aspect of our daily lives was being shaped by her preferences and decisions. The breaking point came Monday morning when I discovered Patricia in our home office, which she'd been gradually converting into storage space for Kevin's medical supplies. She was on the phone with someone, discussing what sounded like insurance or medical billing issues. When she saw me, she smiled and held up one finger to indicate she'd be finished soon. As I listened to her side of the conversation, I realized she was giving our home address as Kevin's primary residence for medical and insurance purposes. She was telling whoever was on the other end of the line that Kevin lived at our address and had been a resident there since his injury occurred. This wasn't just claiming temporary space anymore. Patricia was establishing legal residency for herself and Kevin in our home. When she finished the call, I confronted her about what I'd overheard. Patricia explained that Kevin's doctors and insurance providers needed a stable address for his ongoing care, and that using our address was more reliable than the rural route, address of their former rental house. She assured me it was just a paperwork convenience and didn't mean anything legally significant. But I knew better. By establishing residency at our address, Patricia and Kevin were creating documentation that could complicate any future efforts to ask them to leave. They were building a paper trail that suggested our home was their permanent residence, not a temporary shelter during medical recovery. That evening, I told Robert about Patricia's phone call and my concerns about the residency issue. He was troubled by this development but wasn't sure what steps we should take. We'd been helping family in crisis and didn't want to appear suddenly heartless or unwelcoming. But it was becoming obvious that Patricia had interpreted our generosity as an opportunity to solve her long-term housing and financial problems at our expense. When Robert suggested we needed to have a serious conversation with Derek and Amy about timeline expectations and boundaries, I agreed completely, but I also realized we needed more than just conversation. Patricia had demonstrated that she was skilled at emotional manipulation and reframing situations to her advantage. If we were going to reclaim control of our own home, we needed leverage that couldn't be argued away or guilt-tripped into submission. That night, I remembered the box of documents I'd inherited from my mother when she passed away 5 years earlier. I'd stored everything in her old desk in our basement, meaning to sort through it eventually, but never finding the time. Among those papers was the original deed to our house, which had some unusual provisions I'd never fully understood. My mother had been very particular about legal documentation, and I had a feeling those old papers might contain information that could clarify exactly who had what rights in this situation. The next morning, after Patricia left to take Kevin to physical therapy, I went down to the basement and began searching through my mother's desk. What I found buried in that pile of old documents would change everything, but not in ways I could have imagined. The single piece of paper that emerged from that search would shift the entire power dynamic in our household and remind everyone involved exactly whose house this really was. What I discovered in my mother's desk changed everything I thought I knew about our house. Buried beneath insurance policies and old tax returns was a folder labeled Property Documentation in my mother's careful handwriting. Inside was the original deed to our house, but more importantly, there was a legal document I'd never seen before. A transfer agreement that my mother had executed just months before her death. The document revealed that my mother had never actually transferred full ownership of the house to Robert and me when we moved in 23 years ago. Instead, she'd maintained primary ownership while granting us lifetime residency rights. When she passed away, the property had transferred directly to me as her sole heir, making me the legal owner while Robert held spousal residency rights. We'd been paying the mortgage and property taxes all these years, but the house legally belonged to me alone. My mother had been a careful woman who'd survived the Depression and 2 failed marriages. She'd learned to protect herself legally and financially, and apparently she'd structured our living arrangement to ensure I would never be left homeless or financially vulnerable. The document included specific clauses about residency rights, property decisions, and the authority to determine who could and couldn't live in the house. I sat in that basement for 2 hours, reading and rereading the legal language, trying to fully understand the implications. According to these documents, I had the absolute legal right to determine who lived in this house and under what conditions. No one could establish residency without my explicit written consent, and I had the authority to revoke living arrangements at any time with 30 days' notice. Armed with this knowledge, I felt a surge of confidence I hadn't experienced in months. Patricia could manipulate emotions and family dynamics all she wanted, but she couldn't argue with legal documentation. This house was mine, and I had every right to establish rules and boundaries for anyone living here. But before I could decide how to use this information, the situation upstairs escalated dramatically. I heard raised voices coming from the kitchen, and climbed the basement stairs to find Patricia on the phone again, but this time she was clearly agitated. She was speaking to someone about rental applications and explaining that she and Kevin needed to establish local residency for employment purposes. When she saw me, Patricia quickly ended the call and began preparing lunch as if nothing had happened. But I'd heard enough to understand that she was actively applying for rental properties in our neighborhood, using our address as her current residence to strengthen her applications. She was building a paper trail that would allow her to claim local tenant rights, while simultaneously establishing herself permanently in our home. That afternoon, Derek came home from work early with news that made Patricia's behavior even more concerning. His supervisor had offered him a promotion to assistant maintenance manager, which would mean a significant pay increase and more stable hours. Derek was excited about the opportunity and mentioned that the improved income would allow him and Amy to start seriously looking for their own apartment again. Patricia's reaction to this news was telling. Instead of celebrating Derek's professional advancement, she immediately began voicing concerns about the additional responsibilities and stress the promotion would bring. She suggested that Derek was already working too many hours and that taking on management duties would leave him with even less time for family obligations. She pointed out that Kevin still needed daily assistance with his recovery and that Derek's increased work schedule would place more burden on everyone else. Derek's enthusiasm visibly deflated as his mother continued listing reasons why the promotion might not be the blessing it appeared to be. Patricia suggested that Derek should focus on his current stable position rather than taking risks with new responsibilities, especially when his family was finally settled in a comfortable living situation. Amy arrived home that evening to find Derek uncertain about whether to accept the promotion. When she heard Patricia's concerns, Amy's exhaustion was immediately replaced by sharp focus. She told Derek firmly that he should absolutely take the promotion. That career advancement was exactly what they needed to become financially independent again. She pointed out that Derek had been working toward this kind of opportunity for years, and that turning it down would be a serious mistake. Patricia interrupted Amy's encouragement to express her concerns about the stress additional responsibilities would place on Derek's health and family relationships. She mentioned that men in Kevin's family had a history of heart problems when they took on too much work pressure, and that Derek needed to consider his long-term well-being rather than just immediate financial benefits. The conversation quickly became tense, as Amy realized Patricia was actively discouraging Derek from career advancement that would allow them to move out and regain their independence. Amy's voice became sharper as she pointed out that Derek was perfectly capable of making his own career decisions and didn't need his mother managing his professional choices. Patricia's response revealed her true concerns. She said that Amy's career ambitions had already put enough pressure on Derek, and that adding more work stress to his life would be unfair and potentially damaging to their marriage. She suggested that couples functioned better when one partner focused on career advancement while the other provided emotional support and stability at home. Amy stared at Patricia for a long moment before responding with deadly calm. She said that she and Derek were equal partners who both contributed to their household through their careers, and that neither of them needed Patricia's permission or approval for their professional decisions. She told Derek that she expected him to make his own choice about the promotion based on his own goals and interests. Derek looked miserable as he found himself caught between his wife's expectations and his mother's concerns. He mumbled something about needing to think about all the factors involved and that he'd make a decision in a few days. Amy's expression showed exactly what she thought of his inability to immediately accept an obvious career opportunity. That evening, as Amy worked late on her laptop and Derek avoided the topic of his promotion, Patricia cornered me in the kitchen to discuss what she called family dynamics. She expressed concern that Amy was pushing Derek too hard professionally and suggested that career-focused wives often created unnecessary stress in their marriages by prioritizing achievement over harmony. Patricia mentioned that she'd observed tension between Derek and Amy ever since they'd moved in with us, and that she suspected Amy's work demands were preventing her from providing the emotional support Derek needed during his father's recovery. She suggested that Amy would be happier, and their marriage would be stronger if she focused more on creating a peaceful home environment, rather than chasing professional advancement. I listened to Patricia's analysis with growing anger. She was positioning herself as an expert on Amy's marriage while actively undermining Derek's confidence and career prospects. She was creating the very tension she claimed to observe by inserting herself into decisions that should have been made privately between husband and wife. When Patricia suggested that I might want to have a mother-to-daughter conversation with Amy about the importance of supporting her husband's needs during stressful times, I'd had enough. I told Patricia firmly that Amy and Derek's marriage was none of her business and that her opinions about career priorities were unwelcome and inappropriate. Patricia's reaction was immediate and revealing. Her concerned, helpful facade dropped away, replaced by cold anger. She said that as Derek's mother and Kevin's primary caregiver, she had every right to be concerned about family dynamics that affected her son's well-being. She pointed out that she and Kevin were living in this house too, and that household harmony was everyone's responsibility. I told Patricia that this was my house, and that I would decide what topics were appropriate for discussion and what behavior was acceptable from house guests. Patricia's expression hardened further as she responded that she wasn't a house guest anymore. She was family providing caregiving services that benefited everyone in the household. The conversation escalated quickly from there. Patricia accused me of being territorial and unwelcoming to family members who were contributing to household management and elder care. She said that Kevin's presence had actually improved our home environment by providing male perspective and practical assistance with maintenance issues. I responded that Kevin had done virtually no maintenance work since arriving, and that Patricia's contributions consisted mainly of rearranging our belongings and reorganizing our systems without permission. I pointed out that they were living in our home rent-free while consuming resources and utilities without contributing financially. Patricia's voice became shrill as she denied that they were freeloading. She insisted that Kevin's recovery required expensive medical care, and that they were using their limited resources for necessary health care rather than luxury housing expenses. She said that family members were supposed to support each other during crisis periods and that my attitude showed a shocking lack of compassion for injured and elderly relatives. Our argument attracted Derek's attention, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway looking panicked. He immediately began apologizing for his mother's behavior and trying to de-escalate the conflict. He assured me that his parents were grateful for our hospitality and that they had no intention of taking advantage of our generosity. But Patricia wasn't finished. She told Derek that she was disappointed in how unwelcome she'd been made to feel in what was supposed to be a family home. She said that she'd been doing her best to contribute to household management and Kevin's care, but that her efforts were being criticized and resented rather than appreciated. Derek looked stricken as he tried to mediate between his mother's hurt feelings and my obvious anger. He suggested that maybe everyone was under too much stress and that we should all take some time to cool down before discussing household arrangements further. Amy appeared in the kitchen at that moment, drawn by the raised voices. She took one look at the scene and asked what was happening. When Derek began explaining that there had been a misunderstanding about household responsibilities, Patricia interrupted to provide her own version of events. According to Patricia, I had attacked her for trying to help with household management and had made her feel unwelcome for caring about Derek's career decisions. She said that she was beginning to think she and Kevin should look for alternative arrangements since their presence was clearly resented. Amy's expression grew increasingly cold as she listened to Patricia's account. When Patricia finished speaking, Amy said that perhaps alternative arrangements would indeed be the best solution for everyone involved. She pointed out that Derek's promotion would provide enough income for them to afford their own apartment, and that Kevin's recovery had progressed to the point where he no longer needed constant care. Derek immediately protested that his parents couldn't afford their own place yet, and that Kevin wasn't ready for independent living. He said that moving out prematurely could jeopardize Kevin's recovery and leave his parents without adequate housing options. Amy's response was sharp and definitive. She said that Derek's parents were adults who had managed their own housing for decades before this crisis, and that their temporary stay had already extended far beyond the original timeline. She pointed out that Derek's promotion would allow them to contribute more substantially to his parents' living expenses if they chose to find their own place nearby. Patricia's face flushed red as she realized Amy was not going to be manipulated into extending their stay indefinitely. She said that Amy's selfishness was shocking and that any decent daughter-in-law would prioritize her husband's family obligations over her own convenience. Amy stood up straighter and looked Patricia directly in the eye. She said that she was indeed prioritizing her family obligations, specifically her obligation to build a stable, independent life with her husband. She pointed out that Derek was a grown man who should be supporting his wife's goals, rather than allowing his mother to undermine their marriage and career prospects. Derek tried desperately to find middle ground, suggesting that maybe they could work out a longer timeline that would allow his parents to save money while he and Amy also prepared to move out. But both women were past the point of compromise. Patricia declared that she could see Amy had no respect for family values or elder care responsibilities. She said that Kevin's health and recovery were more important than Amy's career ambitions, and that Derek needed to decide whether he was going to support his injured father or abandon his family obligations to please his selfish wife. Amy's voice became deadly quiet as she responded that Derek's choice was actually between building an adult marriage based on mutual respect or remaining a child who let his mother make decisions about his career and living arrangements. She said that she would not spend another month living in a household where her marriage was being undermined by manipulation and guilt tactics. Derek looked absolutely miserable as he realized he was being forced to choose between his mother's demands and his wife's ultimatum. He tried to argue that the situation wasn't that simple, that his parents genuinely needed help, and that there had to be a solution that worked for everyone. But Patricia made his choice easier by overplaying her hand. She told Derek that if he took the promotion and moved out while Kevin was still recovering, he would be abandoning his family when they needed him most. She said that she would never forgive him for putting his wife's career above his father's health, and that Kevin would be devastated to lose his son's support during the most difficult period of his life. Amy listened to this emotional manipulation with obvious disgust. She told Derek that his mother was using guilt and manufactured crisis to control his decisions, and that this pattern would continue for the rest of their marriage unless he established boundaries immediately. That's when I decided it was time to reveal what I'd discovered in my mother's desk. I excused myself from the kitchen and retrieved the property documents from the basement. When I returned, everyone was still standing in tense silence, waiting to see how the conflict would resolve. I placed the documents on the kitchen table and told everyone that we needed to have a clear understanding about the legal status of our living arrangements. I explained that I had just discovered I was the sole legal owner of this house and that all residency decisions were ultimately mine to make. The room fell completely silent as I continued. I said that while I had been happy to provide temporary assistance during Kevin's medical crisis, the current arrangement had evolved far beyond what I had agreed to accommodate. I pointed out that Patricia had been making permanent plans, establishing residency documentation, and treating temporary assistance as an indefinite housing solution. Patricia immediately began protesting that they had never intended to take advantage of our generosity and that all their arrangements had been temporary. But I cut her off and said that her phone calls about rental applications and medical residency documentation told a different story. Derek looked shocked as he realized his mother had been making plans he wasn't aware of. Amy's expression shifted, from anger to satisfaction as she understood that I was taking control of the situation she'd been struggling to address. I told everyone that effective immediately, we would be returning to the original arrangement. Robert and I would be moving back into our master bedroom, Derek and Amy would return to the guest room, and Patricia and Kevin would resume sleeping in the den. I said that Kevin's recovery had progressed sufficiently to handle the change, and that the medical equipment could be relocated easily. Patricia's face went white, then red, then white again as she processed what I was saying. She began arguing that Kevin needed the master bedroom for his recovery, and that moving him would jeopardize his progress. She said that the physical therapist had specifically recommended the current sleeping arrangement. I responded that Patricia was welcome to discuss alternative medical arrangements with Kevin's doctor, but that our bedroom situation was no longer negotiable. I explained that I had been accommodating about temporary changes, but that I would not allow temporary to become permanent without my explicit agreement. The confrontation that followed would determine whether Patricia accepted the new boundaries or escalated the conflict to a level that would force more dramatic action. But as I stood there holding the legal documents that proved my authority, in this situation, I felt more confident than I had in months. The game had changed, and everyone in that kitchen was about to learn exactly who held the real power in this household. Patricia's reaction to my announcement was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. Her face cycled through multiple expressions, in seconds, from shock to disbelief to calculation, and finally settling on pure rage. She slammed her hand down on the kitchen counter so hard that the coffee mugs jumped, and her voice rose to a pitch that made everyone in the room flinch. She accused me of lying about the documents, claiming that no one kept such important information secret for years without reason. She demanded to see the papers herself and insisted that there must be some mistake or misunderstanding about the legal ownership. When I handed her the deed and transfer documents, she scrutinized them with the intensity of someone looking for forgery, muttering about how convenient it was that these papers had suddenly appeared just when she and Kevin needed stability. Derek stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, his face pale and confused as he tried to process what was happening. He kept looking back and forth between his mother's fury and the legal documents in her hands, clearly struggling to understand how a simple housing arrangement had turned into a legal ownership dispute. When Patricia finally finished examining the papers, she threw them back onto the table and declared that regardless of technicalities, moral obligations to family superseded property rights. Amy, meanwhile, had picked up one of the documents and was reading through the legal language with obvious relief. As a marketing professional, she was comfortable with contracts and legal terminology, and she could see immediately that the documentation was legitimate and comprehensive. For the first time in months, she looked genuinely hopeful that their living situation might finally change. Robert had been quietly listening to the entire confrontation from the doorway, and when Patricia began questioning the validity of the documents, he stepped forward to confirm their authenticity. He explained that my mother had always been extremely careful about legal matters and that she'd had these papers prepared by her attorney specifically to protect our family's interests. He'd known about the ownership structure but had assumed I was aware of it as well. This revelation seemed to deflate some of Derek's confusion, but it only intensified Patricia's anger. She turned on Robert and accused him of conspiring to deceive her family about their living situation. She claimed that if they'd known the house belonged to me personally rather than to both Robert and me jointly, they would have made different decisions about their temporary stay. I found this argument particularly infuriating because it implied that Patricia would have treated me with more respect if she'd known I held legal authority, but felt free to manipulate and control me when she thought I was just another family member without special standing. Her admission revealed that she'd been deliberately testing boundaries and pushing limits because she thought I had no recourse. The confrontation escalated further when Patricia declared that she wouldn't be intimidated by legal technicalities and that family obligations transcended property ownership. She said that Kevin's medical needs were real and ongoing, regardless of who held the deed, and that any decent person would prioritize an injured man's welfare over abstract legal rights. Amy's patience finally snapped completely. She told Patricia that the medical crisis excuse had been stretched beyond credibility and that Kevin's recovery had progressed far enough to handle normal living arrangements. She pointed out that Patricia had been using Kevin's condition to justify increasingly unreasonable demands, and that the original temporary assistance had turned into permanent freeloading. Patricia's response was to attack Amy's character directly. She called Amy selfish, ungrateful, and incapable of understanding family loyalty. She said that Amy's career obsession had blinded her to the real values that mattered in life, and that Derek deserved a wife who understood the importance of supporting extended family during difficult times. Derek finally found his voice and told his mother to stop attacking Amy. But instead of defending his wife strongly, he pleaded for everyone to calm down and find a compromise. He suggested that maybe we could work out a longer timeline that would give his parents more time to save money and find suitable housing while also addressing our concerns about the current arrangement. Amy looked at Derek with complete disgust. She told him that his inability to stand up to his mother's manipulation was exactly why they were in this situation, and that she was tired of being the only person fighting for their marriage and independence. She said that Derek needed to choose immediately between supporting his wife or continuing to enable his mother's controlling behavior. The ultimatum seemed to paralyze Derek even further. He stood there looking miserable while Patricia continued her emotional assault. She told Derek that Amy was trying to force him to abandon his injured father, and that any man who would prioritize his wife's demands over his family's needs wasn't worthy of respect. That's when I realized that Patricia's strategy was to create So much emotional chaos and guilt that Derek would refuse to support any changes to the current arrangement, effectively trapping us all in the dysfunction she'd created. She was counting on Derek's conflict avoidance and Amy's exhaustion to prevent any meaningful resolution. I decided it was time to stop allowing emotional manipulation to drive the conversation. I told everyone that the discussion was over and that I would be implementing immediate changes regardless of anyone's feelings about the situation. I announced that Patricia and Kevin had exactly 2 weeks to find alternative housing arrangements, and that I would be consulting with an attorney about the proper legal procedures for ending their residency. Patricia's reaction was explosive. She screamed that I was heartless and cruel, that I was throwing an injured man out of his home during winter weather, and that Kevin's health would suffer dramatically from the stress of sudden displacement. She accused me of caring more about my own convenience than Kevin's life and recovery. But I had anticipated this emotional manipulation and was prepared with facts. I pointed out that Kevin was walking without assistance, driving to his own medical appointments, and had been cleared by his doctor for normal daily activities. His recovery was essentially complete, and the ongoing physical therapy was preventive rather than critical for his survival. I also mentioned that Patricia had been actively looking at rental properties in the area, which proved that she knew Kevin was ready for independent living. Her rental applications using our address demonstrated that she'd been planning to establish permanent local residency rather than preparing to return to their original community. Derek tried to argue that 2 weeks wasn't enough time for his parents to find decent housing, especially on their limited income. But Amy cut him off and pointed out that Patricia had had months to prepare for this transition and had instead chosen to dig in deeper and establish residency illegally. Amy also revealed something that shocked everyone in the room. She'd been quietly researching rental assistance programs and senior housing options for Derek's parents for the past month, anticipating that their stay would need to end eventually. She'd compiled a list of affordable apartments, mobile home, parks, and subsidized housing options that would work for Patricia and Kevin's budget and medical needs. When Amy produced this research, Derek stared at her with surprise and gratitude. He clearly hadn't realized that his wife had been trying to help his parents transition out while managing her own work stress and dealing with the household chaos. Patricia, meanwhile, looked furious that Amy had been making plans without consulting her. Patricia demanded to know what right Amy had to research housing options for her and Kevin without their permission. She accused Amy of plotting to get rid of them and said that the housing suggestions were probably substandard options designed to make them uncomfortable. Amy's response was calm and factual. She explained that as Derek's wife, she had a legitimate interest in helping his parents find stable housing that would allow everyone to maintain healthy family relationships. She pointed out that the current living arrangement was damaging everyone's well-being, and that finding good alternatives was better than waiting until crisis forced hasty decisions. Robert stepped forward at this point and announced that he supported my decision completely. He said that the original temporary arrangement had evolved into something none of us had agreed to accommodate, and that Patricia's behavior had made it impossible to maintain healthy boundaries in our own home. Patricia immediately turned her fury on Robert, accusing him of being weak and allowing me to make decisions that affected the entire household. She said that real men protected their families from heartless women who put property rights above human needs, and that Robert was failing in his duty as a husband and host. Robert's response surprised everyone, including me. He told Patricia that his primary duty was to protect his wife and daughter from manipulation and abuse, and that her behavior had crossed every line of acceptable houseguest conduct. He said that she'd turned our generosity into entitlement, and our hospitality into hostage-taking. Derek looked devastated as he realized that both Robert and Amy were united against his parents' continued presence in our home. He made one last desperate attempt to negotiate, suggesting that maybe his parents could move to a small apartment nearby, and he and Amy could stay with us a bit longer while saving money for their own place. But Amy immediately rejected this proposal. She told Derek that she was ready to move out immediately with or without him, and that she would not spend another day living in a household where her marriage was being undermined by his mother's manipulation. She said that Derek could choose to come with her or stay with his parents, but that she was done with the current arrangement. This ultimatum finally forced Derek to make the choice he'd been avoiding for months. After a long, painful silence, he told his mother that he would be moving out with Amy and that she and Kevin needed to find their own housing. He said that he loved his parents and would continue to help them, but that he couldn't sacrifice his marriage to enable their unrealistic expectations. Patricia's response was to completely lose control. She screamed that Derek was abandoning his family, that Amy had poisoned him against his own parents, and that she would never forgive him for choosing a selfish wife over his injured father. She declared that if Derek moved out, she would consider him dead to her and would never speak to him again. Derek's face crumpled at his mother's words, but Amy put her hand on his arm and told him firmly that this was exactly the kind of emotional blackmail they needed to escape. She pointed out that healthy parents didn't threaten to disown their children for making normal adult decisions about housing and marriage. The confrontation continued for another hour, with Patricia alternating between threats, guilt trips, and desperate pleas. She promised to be more respectful if they could just have more time, threatened to call social services about elder abuse, and finally resorted to claiming that the stress would kill Kevin and that his death would be on all our consciences. But the legal documentation had changed the entire power dynamic. Patricia could no longer claim equal standing in household decisions or treat our home as her domain. She was now clearly a guest whose welcome had been revoked, and everyone in the room understood that her emotional manipulation no longer carried any weight. I ended the confrontation by announcing that I would be changing the locks in 1 week, and that anyone who wanted continued access to the house needed to coordinate with me directly. I said that Patricia and Kevin had until the following Sunday to remove their belongings and establish residency elsewhere. Patricia made one final desperate attempt to maintain control by declaring that she wouldn't leave and that we would have to go through formal eviction proceedings if we wanted her out. She said that tenant rights laws would protect her and Kevin from sudden displacement, especially given Kevin's medical condition. That's when Amy revealed the final piece of information that destroyed Patricia's last strategy. As part of her research into rental assistance, Amy had also researched tenant rights laws. She explained that Patricia and Kevin had never established legal tenancy because they'd never paid rent, signed a lease, or been granted formal residency rights by the property owner. They were legally house guests whose invitation had been revoked, not tenants with protections against eviction. Derek looked shocked that Amy had researched this issue so thoroughly, and Patricia seemed stunned that her legal threats had been anticipated and neutralized. For the first time since the confrontation began, she appeared to realize that she had no remaining leverage or strategies for maintaining control. The room fell silent as everyone processed the finality of the situation. Patricia and Kevin would be leaving, Derek and Amy would be moving out to their own place, and Robert and I would finally reclaim our home and privacy. After months of manipulation, boundary violations, and emotional chaos, the legal documentation had provided the clarity and authority needed to restore order. But Patricia wasn't finished fighting. Over the next week, she would make several last-ditch attempts to reverse the decision and maintain her position in our household. Her persistence and desperation would require additional measures to ensure that our boundaries were respected and that the transition actually occurred as planned. The week following our confrontation was unlike anything I could have imagined. Patricia threw herself into a campaign of emotional warfare designed to make everyone so miserable that we would beg her to stay just to restore peace. She alternated between weeping dramatically about Kevin's fragile health and raging about the injustice of throwing elderly people out onto the streets during cold weather. Every morning brought new crises. Kevin suddenly developed mysterious symptoms that required immediate medical attention, conveniently timed to occur when Patricia was supposed to be looking at apartments. She claimed he was having panic attacks about the stress of moving, that his blood pressure was dangerously elevated due to anxiety, and that his physical therapy progress was regressing because of the emotional trauma. When Derek suggested they visit Kevin's doctor to address these concerning symptoms, Patricia became defensive and accused him of doubting his father's pain. She said that real medical professionals would never approve of forcing an elderly man to relocate during recovery, and that Kevin's doctors would be horrified to learn how his family was treating him. Derek, caught between his mother's dramatics and his commitment to moving out with Amy, looked increasingly haggard. He was trying to work his regular hours, help his parents' apartment hunt, and support Amy's preparations for their own move. The stress was taking a visible toll on him, and Patricia seemed to take satisfaction in his obvious exhaustion and conflict. Amy, meanwhile, had moved into full organizational mode. She'd taken time off from work to coordinate their move, and had arranged for Derek to view several apartments that fit their budget and timeline. She'd also compiled detailed information about senior housing options for Patricia and Kevin, complete, with application procedures and financial assistance programs. But every time Amy presented housing solutions to Patricia, they were rejected for various reasons. The apartments were too small, too expensive, too far from medical facilities, or located in unsafe neighborhoods. Patricia insisted that she needed to personally inspect every option multiple times before making any decisions, a process that conveniently required weeks rather than days. Robert and I watched this manipulation campaign with growing impatience. Patricia was clearly trying to run out the clock on our deadline, hoping that we would eventually give up and allow the status quo to continue. She seemed to believe that if she could create enough chaos and guilt, we would choose stability over enforcing our boundaries. On Wednesday of that week, Patricia escalated her tactics by inviting Tyler and Monica back for another visit, ostensibly, so they could help pack and provide emotional support during this difficult transition. But when Tyler arrived, it became clear that Patricia had presented the situation to him as a sudden, heartless eviction rather than the ending of a temporary arrangement that had been stretched far beyond its original scope. Tyler immediately confronted Derek about abandoning his parents during their time of need. He accused Derek of being manipulated by Amy into prioritizing his marriage over family loyalty, and suggested that Derek had forgotten the sacrifices Kevin and Patricia had made to raise him. Tyler's arrival turned our household into a battleground, with him serving as Patricia's advocate and enforcer. Amy refused to be intimidated by Tyler's presence. When he suggested that she was being selfish and unreasonable about the housing situation, she calmly presented him with the documentation of Patricia's boundary violations, including the evidence of her attempts to establish permanent residency and her rejection of multiple suitable housing alternatives. Tyler seemed genuinely surprised by some of this information, particularly Patricia's rental applications using our address and her conversations with Kevin's medical providers about permanent residency. When Amy showed him the list of housing options Patricia had rejected without serious consideration, Tyler's support for his mother's position began to waver. But Patricia wasn't finished with her manipulation campaign. On Thursday, she announced that Kevin had fallen in the bathroom and injured his back, requiring immediate medical evaluation and possibly extended bed rest. She claimed that moving him now would be dangerous and that any responsible family would postpone relocation until his condition stabilized. Derek immediately wanted to take Kevin to the emergency room, but Patricia insisted that Kevin was too fragile to be moved and that they should wait for their regular doctor's appointment the following week. This contradiction made everyone suspicious, especially when Kevin seemed to have no trouble walking to the kitchen for meals or sitting comfortably in the living room watching television. Amy confronted Patricia directly about the supposed injury, pointing out that Kevin's behavior didn't match someone experiencing serious back pain. Patricia became defensive and accused Amy of questioning Kevin's credibility and minimizing legitimate medical concerns. That evening, I made a decision that would end Patricia's manipulation campaign once and for all. I called Kevin's doctor's office and requested a home visit to evaluate his condition and determine whether he was medically stable enough to relocate. I explained that we needed professional medical assessment to ensure Kevin's safety during his upcoming move. Patricia was furious when she learned about the doctor's visit I'd arranged. She accused me of going behind her back and interfering with Kevin's medical care. She said that she was Kevin's primary caregiver and that all medical decisions should go through her. But when Dr. Peterson arrived Friday morning, Kevin's supposed back injury had mysteriously resolved itself. The doctor found no evidence of recent trauma or pain, and Kevin admitted under questioning that he'd had no falls or accidents in recent weeks. Dr. Peterson confirmed that Kevin was medically stable and fully capable of normal activities, including relocating to new housing. The doctor's assessment demolished Patricia's latest excuse for delaying their departure. When Derek asked his mother directly about Kevin's supposed fall, she became flustered and claimed that Kevin must have downplayed his symptoms to avoid worrying everyone. But her credibility was clearly destroyed, and even Tyler began questioning her version of events. Saturday arrived with Patricia making one final desperate attempt to avoid leaving. She announced that she'd found an apartment she was interested in, but that it wouldn't be available for another month. She suggested that a short extension of their stay would allow them to secure better housing rather than rushing into an inadequate situation. I refused the extension immediately. I pointed out that Patricia had had months to prepare for this transition and weeks to secure housing after receiving formal notice. Her procrastination and rejection of suitable options were not my responsibility to accommodate further. Derek supported my decision, despite Patricia's tearful pleas and accusations. He told his mother that he and Amy would help her and Kevin get settled in temporary housing if necessary, but that the deadline was firm and non-negotiable. Sunday morning arrived with Patricia and Kevin finally packing their belongings, though. Patricia continued her emotional manipulation until the very end. She wept about being forced to abandon the only stable home Kevin had known since his injury, and predicted that the stress of displacement would cause his health to deteriorate rapidly. But by afternoon, their truck was loaded and they were ready to leave. Patricia had managed to secure a small furnished apartment across town that would accommodate their immediate needs while they continued looking for permanent housing. Derek and Amy had helped with the deposit and first month's rent, ensuring that his parents weren't left without resources. As Patricia and Kevin prepared to drive away, Patricia made one last attempt to guilt Derek into changing his mind. She told him that he was making the biggest mistake of his life and that he would regret choosing Amy over his family. She predicted that his marriage would fail and that he would come crawling back to his parents for forgiveness, only to find that they would never trust him again. Derek's response surprised everyone, including himself. He told his mother that he loved her and Kevin, but that their relationship couldn't continue to be based on manipulation and emotional blackmail. He said that he hoped they could build a healthier dynamic once everyone had their own space and independence. Amy stood beside Derek throughout this final confrontation, but she didn't need to say anything. Her presence alone was enough to remind Patricia that Derek had chosen his wife and their future together over his mother's demands for control. After Patricia and Kevin drove away, Derek and Amy returned to the house to collect their own belongings. They'd found a small but comfortable apartment closer to both their workplaces, and Derek had accepted his promotion with enthusiasm and confidence. For the first time in months, he looked genuinely happy and optimistic about the future. Amy thanked Robert and me repeatedly for standing up to Patricia's manipulation and supporting their independence. She said that the experience had been difficult but educational, and that she felt much more confident about her ability to handle family conflicts in the future. Derek was more subdued in his gratitude, still processing the reality that his mother had been willing to damage his marriage and financial stability to maintain control over his life. But he expressed relief that the situation was finally resolved, and that he could focus on building his career and relationship without constant interference. Robert and I spent that evening alone in our house for the first time in months. We reclaimed our master bedroom, restored our belongings to their original locations, and began the process of returning our home to the peaceful environment we'd enjoyed before Patricia's invasion. The house felt enormous after months of overcrowding. We walked through each room, appreciating the quiet and privacy we'd taken for granted. I prepared a simple dinner for just the two of us, using ingredients Patricia wouldn't have approved of and cooking methods she would have criticized. That night, as we lay in our own bed for the first time since Patricia had manipulated us out of it, Robert and I reflected on what we'd learned from the experience. We talked about the importance of establishing clear boundaries from the beginning, the danger of allowing temporary assistance to become permanent arrangements, and the power of legal documentation to cut through emotional manipulation. Over the following weeks, we received occasional updates about Patricia and Kevin's situation. They'd settled into their temporary apartment and were slowly adjusting to independent living again. Kevin's health remained stable, despite Patricia's predictions of decline, and he'd even found part-time work at a local hardware store. Derek visited his parents regularly and maintained a relationship with them, but on his own terms, rather than according to Patricia's demands. He'd learned to set boundaries and stick to them, even when Patricia tried to return to her old manipulation tactics. Amy thrived in their new apartment and threw herself into her career with renewed energy. Without the constant stress of household conflict, she was able to focus on professional development and began receiving recognition for her innovative marketing campaigns. Derek's promotion also went well, and their combined income allowed them to start saving for a house of their own. 3 months after Patricia and Kevin moved out, Derek and Amy announced that they were expecting their first child. The pregnancy was planned and welcomed, and they were excited about starting their family in their own space with clear boundaries about extended family involvement. Patricia's reaction to the pregnancy news was predictably manipulative. She immediately began planning to move back to Riverside to help with childcare, suggesting that new grandparents had both rights and responsibilities regarding their grandchildren's upbringing. But Derek shut down these plans immediately, explaining that he and Amy would determine their own childcare arrangements and extended family visiting schedules. 6 months later, Derek and Amy purchased a small house in a neighborhood they loved, with a yard perfect for their growing family and space for hosting relatives on their own terms. They invited Patricia and Kevin to visit for holidays and special occasions, but made it clear that these visits had specific timeframes and expectations. Patricia tested these boundaries repeatedly during the first year, trying to extend visits, criticize parenting decisions, and insert herself into household management. But Derek had learned to recognize and resist her manipulation tactics, and Amy had developed effective strategies for maintaining their independence. Robert and I became devoted grandparents when Derek and Amy's daughter Emma was born. We babysat regularly, provided practical support when needed, and enjoyed watching our granddaughter grow up in a stable, loving home environment. The contrast between our respectful involvement and Patricia's demanding interference was stark and obvious to everyone involved. As Emma grew older, she naturally gravitated toward the grandparents who treated her parents with respect and supported their family autonomy. Patricia's attempts to compete for Emma's attention through gifts and special privileges backfired, as Derek and Amy taught their daughter to value relationships based on kindness and respect rather than material offerings. 2 years after the initial housing crisis, Patricia and Kevin moved to a senior community that better met their needs and budget. The transition was difficult for Patricia, who had envisioned spending her retirement years surrounded by grandchildren. She could influence and control, but Kevin seemed happier in an environment where he could socialize with peers and pursue his own interests without constantly managing Patricia's emotional demands. Derek's relationship with his parents eventually stabilized into something healthier than it had ever been during his childhood. He learned to love them while maintaining clear boundaries about their role in his adult life. Patricia never fully accepted these limitations, But she gradually adapted to them as she realized that her manipulation tactics no longer worked. Amy and I developed a close relationship based on mutual respect and shared experiences. She often thanked me for modeling how to stand up to family manipulation and for showing her that kindness didn't require accepting abuse. We became genuine, friends as well as family members, supporting each other through various life challenges and celebrating successes together. The legal documents that had changed everything remained safely stored in my desk, but their importance went far beyond their practical application. They had served as a reminder that respect for boundaries required the power to enforce them, and that emotional manipulation could only succeed when people felt powerless to resist it. Looking back on that difficult period, I realized that Patricia's invasion of our home had actually strengthened our family relationships by forcing us to clarify our values and establish healthy boundaries. Derek learned to prioritize his marriage and independence. Amy discovered her own strength and resilience, and Robert and I renewed our commitment to protecting our home and relationship from outside interference. The experience also taught me that generosity without boundaries wasn't actually kindness at all. By allowing Patricia to manipulate and control our household, I had enabled behavior that damaged everyone involved, including Patricia herself. Real compassion required setting limits that encouraged healthy relationships rather than codependent dysfunction. Today, our house is once again a peaceful sanctuary where Robert and I can enjoy our retirement years surrounded by chosen activities and welcome visitors. We host Derek, Amy, and Emma regularly, and our home serves as a gathering place for celebrations and holidays. But every person who enters our house understands that they are guests in our domain, welcome to stay as long as they respect our boundaries and contribute positively to our household harmony. The document that changed everything sits quietly in my desk drawer, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon against manipulation is simply the truth about who really holds the authority to make decisions. Patricia learned that emotional blackmail is no match for legal documentation, and Derek discovered that family loyalty means protecting the people you love from those who would harm them, even when those harmful people are family members themselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.